Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Kuf Samach Bet. This week's learning is sponsored by Debbie and Yossi Gvir for the refuah shlema of Eitan Asher Ben Dvarach B'Chaim Zelik. Eitan was wounded while protecting Am Yisrael in Lebanon 2.5 weeks ago. May he and his buddies continue to heal steadily along with all of Tzahal's wounded soldiers. Okay, today we have a very short daf. I'll use the opportunity to just mention that we're going to have a siyum Be'ezrat Hashem in 2 weeks. The siyum will be on Wednesday, December 18th. And we're going to hear from Brooke Pollack, who will speak about disinherited, how policy reflects values. And we'll hear from Alana Storch, both of them being learners of Hadran, about sanctifying private space, lessons from Hezek Re'iyah, which will be a good, starting from both the beginning of the Masechet, where we learned Hezek Re'iyah, and the end of the Masechet, where we dealt with inheritance laws. So it should be a very interesting siyum, and really looking forward. And the registration will go up within a day or two, something like that, hopefully by the end of this week. Okay, we're going to get started with the end of Kuf Samach Aleph Amud Bet. So we saw at the very end of yesterday's daf 2 halachot of Rabbi Yochanan about documents. This is our major topic right now. All different things about documents. We talk about erasing things. The first halacha had to do with erasing, and you have to write at the end of the document, I erased something on line X, and you have to do like a kiyum. Okay, either do it before the signatures. We talked about if it was after the signatures, you have to have the witnesses sign again. And this other halacha, which is the major halacha for today, the last line of the document is always a review, some sort of review of what was before, of the main part of the document, the gist of the document. My time. What's the reason for this? So Amar Rav Amram, Rav Amram says the reason is because we're not allowed to do anything based on the last line of a document, and that's why the only thing it can contain is some sort of review. Because if it were to contain new information, we wouldn't be able to hold by it. Now, why can't we hold by it? This is what we said yesterday, because there's a concern that the Eidim, now this is something we didn't get into yesterday, I'll get into it right now, which is, what's the issue? The assumption here is that the Eidim can't sign exactly or may not sign exactly right underneath the text. They might leave some space. Why is that? So the Rashbam says it's just the way they sign, like there was always a little bit of space and someone could always squeeze in an extra line there. That's one possibility, although it doesn't really make so much sense. Why can't the Eidim actually sign just right under without leaving any space at all? So the Ramah with a hey, not the Ramah with an aleph who comments on the Shulchan Aruch, but the Ramah with a hey, he says that often people would leave, if a witness would sign, they would often leave a space just in case a more distinguished witness came along. So if I were to sign, I would sign lower down in case someone more important than me came, and I would leave that. It was like a more prominent space for a different witness, and therefore often there were times there was a space left, and because there was normally a space left, again, either because it was impossible for the witness to sign so close to the text, or because, which by the way, could be because there's the body of the text, and then there's a little space, and it's like their area where they sign is a little bit off from the text, and there's a little space there. Somebody could theoretically add something because they're worried about forgeries, about someone adding some additional obligation, condition, stipulation into the document, which nobody signed on and wasn't really supposed to be there, right? It was put in after the signatures. We basically don't allow us to rely on anything in that last line. And therefore, that leads us to Rabbi Yochanan's halacha. Well, what are you going to put in that last line then? Some sort of summary, nothing new, basically. So Amar le Rav Nachman, le Rav Amram. Rav Nachman says to Rav Amram, "Minalacha, where do you get this from, this idea that you can't learn from the last line?" Amar le, he says, I learn it from Tanya of the following braita. Hirchik et ha'edim shnei shitim min hachtav pasul. Shita achat kashel. So the halacha in the braita is, you can't distance, when you put your signatures on a document, you can't leave 2 blank lines, but you can leave 1 blank line. Okay, how does Rav Amram get it from here? So Rav Amram explains. What's the reason you can't leave 2 lines? Because somebody might add something in that's not supposed to, that wasn't there before, before the witness is signed. Well, on that same note, 1 line would be the same thing. So therefore, he says, why does 1 line work and 2 lines doesn't? He says it must be that you can't learn, you can't do anything based on that last line. And that's why leaving one line will actually be a fine document, because there's no worry that someone's going to add and we're going to hold by it, because we just don't hold by the last line. And therefore, he proves in that braita that basically allows one line, doesn't allow two lines, that must be the reason. Okay, we're kind of done with that. But now the Gemara is going to ask, Ibailahu, moving out of Amabet. Let's see, this is going to be, we're going to zip through the stuff. Ibailahu, Shitava mechtzemai. Classic, it's like a Rabbi Yirmiyah type question. Just going to lead us to assume we're going to get back to Rabbi Yirmiyah. If you remember, he was kicked out of the Beit Midrash. Soon he'll come back, but not yet. Shitava mechtzemahu. What about 1.5 lines? What do we do with that? Is that okay? Is it not okay? Now, what is this question? What is 1.5 lines? So there's a big debate among commentaries. The Ravid says you left the one blank line and then a half a line, and at the end of that half line, the witness is signed. Tosfot says that can't possibly be what they're talking about. Tosfot, in a very modern kind of way, or not modern, but I think of it with our modern eyes, Tosfot says it's how wide a space you left. Like line spacing, there's double spacing, right? Single spacing, double spacing, 1.5. So he's basically saying if you left 1.5 spacing, then in 1.5 spacing, could you theoretically fit 2 lines of text, right? That's really the question according to Tosfot. If it's a little wider than 1, but not as wide as 2, is there a concern that someone could still add in 2 lines of text? Because I use a smaller font, and then they could add it in. So let's try to figure out our answer. To get to an answer, first they're going to quote the braita on the previous Amud that we just learned. Then they're going to show, can't learn it from there because it could go either way. And then they're going to basically jump to another braita where it's actually, the answer is pretty clear. If you remember, what did the braita say that we saw on the previous Amud? Right? 2 no, 1 yes. So now the Gemara is going to take each part of that line and say the following. First, they're going to say, so Tashma, let's learn from here. Right? If it's 2 lines, it's pasul. That sounds like anything less than 2 would be okay. What's the problem? The problem is, well, you could derive the opposite from the second part, and we've done this already many times, where they try to say, oh, from here it says this is no good, so the other thing must be good, and then they say, oh, but it says that is good, and it doesn't include the other, so it doesn't really work. So again, they assume that means shita v'mechzer would be kasher. But in Maseifa, the continuation says shita achat kasher. It actually tells you what's okay, and it says only 1 line is okay, which seems to imply hashita v'mechzer pasul. Sounds like any more than 1 would be no good. So because it told you 2 is no good, 1 is good, it left the middle totally open, and therefore elameha le'kalamashma mina. We definitely can't infer anything from that braita, so move on. My hafe'ala. So the Gemara says, okay, so what's the story? 1.5. What would be? Tashma Tanya. Let's learn from this braita. Here it's going to be very clear. Here pasul. Okay, so it starts off. If the witnesses distance their signature by 2 lines, they left 2 open spaces before their writing, pasul, it would be disqualified. Pachot mikan pashel. Now it says it very clearly. Anything less than that would be okay, which sounds like 1.5 is totally fine. And presumably the reason is that they didn't really play with fonts, right? I'm thinking now like somebody says, I want a 1-pager, right? And to get it all into 1 page, sometimes you play with the fonts, you play with the spacing. Sounds like it was pretty standard in those days. And there was no chance that we were going to squeeze 2 lines into a 1.5 spacing there. Okay, now we're going to continue that braita and get into something a little bit different, but connected. That braita that we just quoted to prove it continues and says the following. And then we're done with our daf already. Hayu arba'a v'chamisha edim chatumim al hashtar v'nimtza echad mehem karov upasul. If you have 4 or 5 witnesses signed on a document, and one of them turns out to be a karov or a pasul, either a relative or a disqualified witness, we're end of the Masechet, we're kind of heading already towards Sanhedrin about disqualified witnesses. So if one of them is a disqualified witness, titkayem edu bashal. You can establish the testimony based on the other witnesses. You can ignore their testimony and say, okay, so there's someone disqualified here. It doesn't really matter. Now, the commentaries say this is a bit of a problem because the Masechet Makot talks about if a group of witnesses came together and some were disqualified witnesses or relatives, it disqualifies the whole testimony because they're viewed as one whole group coming. And if one is no good, then, right, they're all disqualified because it reflects poorly on everybody, really. And why are you testifying together with people that shouldn't be testifying? Right? Again, there's a difference. We'll get to this all, the difference between psulim, which are like liars and thieves and people who are suspect they're going to take money to lie in court, where they're not believable, whereas relatives are just not believed for their relative, even though they are trustworthy people. But either which way, both of those disqualified people ruin testimony for other people, basically. If one is canceled, then they're all canceled. So why in this document do we not say the same thing? So some people say that this is only, some people have a girsa here, a different version, that it's only if they're the top witnesses. Okay, if there's a list of 5 or 4, whatever it is, but they're at the top, then we assume, and that goes back to what I said before, that the Rama said, that often the top spaces were left for distinguished people. And it could be, now it's hard to say a disqualified witness would be a distinguished person, although sometimes people could be distinguished people and then become, do bad things, but probably more the relatives, that it was like a place of honor to put the relative's signature there, even though everyone knew that it wasn't meant to be really a witness signature. They weren't meant to be witnesses, but the relatives, they can't testify for this person. And perhaps that's one way to view it. Other people say that this whole law of if you come and testify together with a group of people and one is puzzled, it disqualifies them all. That would only be for testimony that you bring to court and say, I saw the following thing happen. But maybe that's not true at all for documents, and signing on documents is a different story. And one of the possible reasons why signing on documents is a different story is because a document itself is considered usually like something kasher. It already has standing because it's written, like as opposed to just, someone coming to court and saying whatever they say. But once something's written and there's signatures on it, already establishes it. So if there's one disqualified witness, it doesn't really bother us. So there's a bit of a question about how that reconciles with this. And since we have time, I figured I would go into the different opinions. But anyway, we're going to get back to our issue now. So that's the law. The law is if there's 4 or 5 witnesses signed, okay, this doesn't seem connected, but in a minute we're going to connect it to our topic. 4 or 5 witnesses signed, one is 1 or 2 or 3 even, as long as there's 2 good signatures, we can establish a document based on those 2 signatures. Now the Gemara says, this supports Chizkiah. So this braita that says that it's okay if one is disqualified, it supports Chizkiah. The Amar Chizkiah mil'uhu bikrovim kasher. What does this mean? And there's a bit of a debate about what this means, but assuming this has to do with our topic and it's talking about where there's an empty space of 2 rows. If there's 2 rows empty, which is a problem because there's always a concern that maybe someone's going to add something in. Well, let's say the witness is signed and left this 2 lines of space. And in the meantime, before the document came to court to be, either to be ratified or to be used, like let's say I lent you money and I want to go collect and I come to court and there's 2 blank lines, they're going to tell me, sorry, no can do. This is a disqualified document because it wasn't done properly. And we shouldn't have done it in the first place like that because someone could have forged it, right? And there's concern that there's going to be some forgery. But if you fill in that empty space, let's say I had this document, it was done and they, for whatever reason, signed with the 2 empty lines, but I filled it in with signatures of relatives, let's say, okay, right? It's the easiest thing to do because my relatives are in my house. Just say, can you just sign here so that it's filled in? Now, what does that resolve? Well, that means now I can't add anything like, oh, and you owe me some more money, or something like that. So if we fill it in with disqualified witnesses, then we bring that document to court and the court sees that there's these witnesses there. And even if originally it was blank space, the fact that we filled it in with relatives resolves the issue. Okay? So Mal'ul b'krovim kasher, and that is basically supported by what we just, that line, the Chizkiah said that you can fill it in with relatives and it'll be okay, is supported by that braita, because the braita says if you have relatives signed, it's not going to disqualify the document. So that's a good support. And al titma, I think this is Chizkiah's words, and don't be surprised by this halacha that you could fill, right? It seems a little bit weird. You're filling in something, there's an empty space, and you're filling it in with something that's disqualified. It's not even acceptable in court. Seems a little bit strange. Well, I'll give you an example from a totally different place. from Sharei Avir Sukkah Posel B'Shlosha, Schach Pasul Posel Ba'arba'a. What is this halacha? So there's two possible cases that it could be here. We'll start with one. I'll explain it to the end, and then I'll explain the second case. Let's say you have a sukkah with 3 walls. A sukkah with 3 walls is kasher. However, if you have to have 3 walls minimum. So if the two, imagine the 2 opposite walls, and the schach is going in the direction those walls are going, and in the middle of your sukkah you have a big gap of schach, and there's no schach. Now, what that gap is going to basically do is it's going to divide your sukkah in half. You're going to have, imagine it, right? Wall, 2 opposite walls, and the space is, like I said, running parallel to those 2 opposite walls. You're going to end up with a sukkah with 2 walls and a sukkah with 2 walls, because each sukkah is going to divide the sukkah into 2, and each sukkah now is only going to have 2 walls. That's a problem. So how wide does that gap need to be in order to say this is 2 sukkahs? Our famous number from sukkah, 3 handbreadths, because that's a size that we don't view this whole thing as one continuum anymore. We have a break. And then it's 2 different sukkahs. So 3 tvachim is the size. Another case, by the way, I'll already get to the other case, and then I'll go back to the schach pasul. Another case could be if you have a sukkah with 4 walls, but it's a very small sukkah. Now, it's a small sukkah that's big enough. It's got the minimum size of a sukkah required. But if you were to basically have a break in the sukkah in the middle, okay, let's say you have a really big sukkah. Let's start with that. You have a really big sukkah with a big hole in the middle of schach, running from one wall to the other. So a whole length of the sukkah, you have a break, as you still have, when you split it, 3 walls on one side and 3 walls on the other side. So that's okay. But if your sukkah is not big enough, that if you were to split it into 2, each side is too small, then you're basically disqualifying your sukkah, or at least one of the sides is too small, then that side will be disqualified, right? You won't be able to sit in that sukkah. Obviously, you can't sit in the area where there's no schach, but theoretically, if it's big enough, you could sit on the sides. But, so again, what's a big enough gap to divide it? 3 tvachim, because remember, levud, what's levud? Anything less than 3 tvachim, it's viewed as if there's a continuum. It's viewed as if it's there. So that's your measurement. However, now here we're going to have a very similar thing. If you fill in that schach with schach that's disqualified, there's all sorts of material that cannot be used as schach. If you fill in that gap with disqualified schach, you actually gain a tefach. It's only going to be disqualified at the size of 4 tvachim. Okay, you're going to need 4 tvachim of schach pasul to disqualify that sukkah, of a gap that's filled with schach pasul. Because even though it's disqualified schach, it actually can help you. Okay, it can help fill in a gap. That's basically what this halacha teaches. And that's exactly the same thing about this gap of the 2 lines can be filled in with disqualified signatures. So you wouldn't have thought to make that comparison, but it's the same idea, that having something, even if it's disqualified, is better than nothing. Just interesting. Okay, something to think about in terms of, could you apply that to your life? How filling in something, right? Usually you would say maybe not, but somehow this is saying, and you have to think about what the meaning of this really is, but having something there is better than having nothing there, even if the something is something that's generally disqualified. So let's do a quick review. That's the end of our daf. We started with this halacha of Rabbi Yochanan that Rav Amram came and established why we do the review at the end. And the last line is always some sort of nothing new. And that's because we're not allowed to learn anything from one line. And that's because generally leaving one line would be okay. Since it's okay, there's a concern someone might add something, and therefore we don't rely on anything that's in that line. And therefore we fill it with just kind of a summary and nothing that's anything new. Then we proved it from a braita, right? He brought it to prove his point that the braita distinguished 2 lines is no good. 1 line is good. Why would 1 blank line be good if you could fill it in? Because it must be. We don't hold by anything written in the last line. And then we asked about what about 1 line, 1.5 lines? We tried to prove it from that braita, but it didn't work. We then proved it from another braita where it seems clear 1.5 is fine. We did talk about there were 2 different interpretations of 1.5, what it is. And we then brought this braita. In that braita we brought to prove it had this other halacha about having the disqualified witnesses. And then we showed that braita supports what Chizkiah said about that if you fill it in with relatives, you have a blank space and you fill it in with relatives, it's actually fine. And from there we compared it to the sukkah and how schach pasul is actually better than having no schach at all. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.